Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the organisers, Jocelyn and Sterren and everybody else who's been behind this very interesting and I think very successful conference. And I think it's really good that we've been able to look at the concept of roads and communication over these deep time periods, but of course with kind of more emphasis perhaps on the Islamic period. Now, what I'd like to talk about today is about the Syrian Hajj Route, something which I've worked on for quite a few years now. And I'd like to just introduce a few ideas about how we can kind of think about the route during the Ottoman period, and also to think a little bit about how we can use different forms of evidence to get like a richer understanding of exactly what was going on. So I suppose the first thing to say is that, as probably most of you are aware, the Ottomans under Sultan Selim took over from the Mamluk Sultanate in the early 16th century. And up till that point, the Ottoman contact with let's say, the Arab world was much more limited. They obviously had some contacts, but really this is the first time that they had to occupied and took over a large state, Muslim state. And so, whereas before, let's say in the Balkans, they'd been primarily occupying and fighting against conquering Christian territory. And within Anatolia, the people they're dealing with, I suppose, were a mixture of different types of people, Turks, but not really many Arabs. So that's one thing to consider. So the fact that they're able to take over from the Mamluk sultans, suddenly they're in a new position, and which gave them new responsibilities and obviously new challenges. And central to this, I think, I'd argue, is their attitude and how they dealt with the Hajj route, with their connection to Mecca. Now, there's been some discussion and debate, and there still is, about the precise relationship of the Ottomans to Mecca and to the Sharif of Mecca, and to what extent it actually was Ottoman territory, to what extent they actually controlled it, and that's a debate that's ongoing. But I think one of the benefits of looking at the material culture, looking at and related materials, is to see how their intentions are expressed physically, and I think it may tell you more than some of the official documents. So. And I've just got two examples here, just to show how much the Hajj and the idea of Mecca, the Kaaba, was deeply imbued in Ottoman culture. So on the left, you've got this 16th century compass in the British Museum with a depiction of the Kaaba at the center. And this is obviously for determining the Qibla. And again, it really needs to be stressed how this direction of Mecca was really very present within Muslim civilization, within Muslim culture. But the fact that this was immediately after the conquest, the Ottomans took on the idea to a much greater extent. And then on the right, we've got a ceramic tile from Berlin, again with a depiction of the Kaaba and this is one of many Iznik tiles which can be found in mosques throughout the empire. There's a famous one in the Rustam Pasha mosque. So really, for the Ottomans, it looks as if their conquest, and these all date from after the conquest of the Mamluk Sultanate, so these all reinforce the importance of the Hajj and of Mecca to the Ottomans. Now, what was their motivations? Well, I'll just list a few, kind of as an idea. So one, of course, was that they took over the title of servant of, or the two sanctuaries, and this again was a responsibility. The other important thing that these were really, the Ottomans had become, by their conquest of the Mamluk Empire, the largest Muslim state since the 10th century. This is like suddenly they had to deal with a new scale of government. The other thing I think is it's easy to forget if you're thinking about Syria and Arabia. It's easy to forget that the Ottomans were simultaneously also still working or still fighting places in the Balkans, in southeastern Europe, and of course the Safavids. So again, there was perhaps the idea of reinforcing their Muslim identity against the Christians. And also then there's the question of how they related to the Safavids, the Shia Safavids, and how they dealt with that. So that's religious things. And then there's also, in their attitude to the Hajj routes, there's also military factors. And one of the most important of these is to counter the Portuguese threat in the Red Sea. And we know that the Portuguese had plans to occupy Mecca. So that's kind of one thing to counter that. And also through that, there's the whole question of the spice road, which we'll come to in a minute. And then there's also the conquest of Yemen, which also had other implications. And then the third sort of military consequence is dealing with the Bedouin. Now, it's apparent from looking at documents relating to, for example, Palestine, that Bedouin were perceived in the early 16th century as a problem to deal with. And in some senses, the Hajj routes the Syrian Hajj route can be a way of interacting with the Bedouin and perhaps containing them. That's military factors. And then there's also economic factors which are involved, and you get this in all of the Hajj routes. Just quick, you're probably all familiar with this type of map showing the numerous Hajj routes. So economic factors included access to the Red Sea trade, spices, and increasingly coffee, which in the Ottoman period becomes an incredibly important commodity, and bought and sold by pilgrims as well as merchants. And also, of course, that obviously related to the situation in Yemen. So, in the 16th century, almost as soon as the Ottomans had taken over from the Mamluks, they began carrying out work on the Syrian route. And so by the 18th century, mid-18th century, more than 26 forts had been built along the route. Now, there are two main phases of construction. The first phase was in the 16th century, and this was mostly on the northern part of the route in what is today Syria and Jordan. And so even in the short time that Selim I, because he died in 1520, that he had having control of Syria, he built forts at Muzarib, Mafraq, which is also known as Fudain, and possibly Udra. So straight away there was just in the early 16th century there was an intention to do something about the Hajj route. And then in the mid 16th century, more forts were built at Katrana, Man, Dat al-Hajj, and then late 16th century from Uneza. One of the things which we got from Elodie's talk about the medieval route is that the Ottoman route, the Ottomans adopted a new route. And from oral history, I haven't yet found any documentary evidence of this, but from oral history from Peak Pasha, there's this idea that this new route, the desert route, so within Jordan, it's further east, was known as the Tariq al-Bint after one of Suleiman's daughters who went on the Hajj and complained about having to go up and down, so she wanted a more, whether this is true or not, but it's certainly within the oral history. The other thing that's worth just mentioning in this early period, in the 16th century, is that simply the presence of any Ottoman military was enough to kind of dissuade attack from the Bedouin. So there's a famous example of an attack of the caravan at Katrana, and the head of the caravan, the Emir al-Hajj, just asked the military band to play some music, and apparently the Bedouin just fled. So in the 16th century, it was not. It's just a picture. It was not really a problem. However, if we go back to this picture, you'll see. So the ones in black, I don't know if you can see them, the solid ones. They're the 16 forts which existed in the 16th century, and the ones that are just white rectangles, they were built in the 18th century. So significantly, nothing was built in the 17th century, but in the 18th century, at least 15 new forts were built. And I suppose the question is why. There's two reasons. One is that by the 18th century, the Bedouin had access to firearms which could be used on horseback. They did exist before, but they weren't as good in the 16th century, and the Bedouin didn't have access to them. But from the 18th century, they're starting to get guns supplied mostly through Haifa and through Lebanon, and at the same time, there's also the problem that Bedouin subsidies that had been paid to the Bedouin from the 16th century were no longer of any value. So there's both the Bedouin both had more reason to attack Ottoman assets and also more means. And so in 1557 and on a number of other occasions, there are huge attacks on the caravan. In one instance, the whole caravan was destroyed. So that's just a brief resume of the history of this fortification. Then the question is what do these forts, which I'm going to talk about, what do these stations actually do? So here I've got a picture from Suraya Farugi's book on the Ottoman Hajj, and this shows the Hajj routes and also the courier routes. So the courier routes are the dotted routes, and you've got the pilgrimage route from Cairo and the pilgrimage route from Istanbul, Damascus, and Mecca. One of the interesting things is you can see the Syrian route coincides with the Syrian Hajj route, also coincides with the courier route, whereas the Egyptian route doesn't. So this was regarded as a very high priority route within the Ottoman Empire, and is one of 7 major routes, strategic routes, which were required to run the empire. This, by the way, this map is based on a manuscript from the mid-17th century. So there is the question of how did these forts help and what were they doing? Well, one of the things that's important to say is that they were not accommodation for pilgrims. Despite any resemblance to caravanserais, they didn't function in that way. What complicates this a little bit is you get some references, say, for example, at Katrana, one of the forts, one of the stops in Jordan, you get reference to a Khan at Katrana, and many people think that the current fort there is not that. I think it's more likely that there was also another building which was used as a Khan. So the purpose of these structures was probably, first of all, to protect water resources. Second, as a contact point for payment of tribes, where they'd be kind of paid their subsidies. Storage of supplies, and that would be both food and weapons. And also, as a courier links direct to Istanbul. So that's kind of very important, that it's a secure route. Now, the main thing I wanted to talk about today really is the different types of evidence that you can use to look at these. And I think what's interesting is, on the one hand, you get the route as a whole, and that's a macro picture, which is very interesting. But also, each of these stations is a site in themselves. It has its own sort of micro history, which is also important. And I think one of the good things about looking at these structures is that you've got looking at it, we've got a range of evidence which we can deploy, and we can really get some sort of quite rich ideas of individual sites, which feeds into a better idea of how the route as a whole worked. So the types of records we've got in general, they can be divided into 4 main groups. So that's imperial Ottoman records from archives, that's one thing. Then there's European travellers' accounts, and these go back, for the Ottoman period, well, we go back pre-Ottoman, so we go back to at least the 15th century for European accounts. And then we have inscriptions relating to the actual buildings themselves. And lastly, the Muslim travellers' accounts. So today I'd just like to talk a little bit about those last two, about the inscriptions and Muslim travellers' accounts. So here you have a table of inscriptions found located on the forts. Not all the inscriptions are still in situ, but it's worth just briefly reviewing them. So there's 17 inscriptions from 8 forts. We don't need to do. So I'll just quickly go on. Yeah, I could go on for a long time, yeah. Okay, so this is just an example of the type of evidence we're looking at. So this is an inscription from the fort at Man in Jordan, dated 971. And this is important because it's important within the context of the Hajj route, but it's also important generally for Ottoman culture because it's one of the oldest inscriptions in Ottoman Turkish. Other inscriptions have been in Arabic or Persian. I think there's an older one in Bosnia. But and this was probably made in Istanbul and taken down on the Hajj route to the Marne. So that's an example of a building inscription. Now, the other thing I'd like to talk about is Hajj accounts. So we've got lots of people, Muslim writers. So we've got the most famous, I suppose, is Evliya Çelebi, and who was voluminous, loads of volumes on his travels, and he travelled on the Syrian Hajj route in 1672. The important thing to say about him is he's like a very privileged traveller, and he seems to have been connected. We're not quite sure who he was, but he seems to have been connected with the military as well. So he went to Mecca with a military group of 5,000 troops accompanying the caravan. So that's Evliya Çelebi, let's say a very aristocratic person, very close to the government. You can also say a little bit about his writing is perhaps slightly unreliable, very picturesque, but it's a certain style. And then the next one I'd like to focus on is Murtada ibn al-Awan. Now, he's a very different type of pilgrim. He was from Damascus, and he was a Sufi. And from the accounts, he seems much closer to the ordinary pilgrims. So he talks about lighting fires in the campsite, and he talks about how they had to bargain for camels and all this sort of thing. He was very much on a different kind of level. And he'd actually made a previous Hajj in 1677, but he said he forgot where he went on this, so he thought it would be a good idea to go on the Hajj again and write a little bit of a description of all the forts and what he encountered. So that's another person, and then I seem to have missed one. Oh yeah, I'll just briefly say about Qutbuddin Nahrawali. He's quite interesting because he was sent by the Sharif of Mecca on a mission to Istanbul. So he actually did the Hajj in reverse. He actually went on the Syrian Hajj route from Mecca to Istanbul. One of the interesting things about him, he's actually born in India, and his family is from India. He'd also gone on missions to Gujarat as well. So, and he kind of records his impressions of the Hajj route. So, and also that reinforces the idea of this road being a diplomatic route. And then the final one I'll just mention briefly is Mehmed Adib. He was an Ottoman judge from Crete, And his book on the Hajj seems kind of semi-official, and it was one of the first. It was printed in Istanbul and then later translated into French. This is by Bianchi. So I'll just give you a few quick case studies. So this is the fort at Dat al-Hajj, and this is one of the first forts to be built. This is built by Suleiman. Now, Mutada, who was visited in 1709, wrote that a couple of years before, the western wall had fallen down of this fort. But then by the time Mehmed Edip reached the fort in 1779, this western wall had been rebuilt. And so I think we can, when we look at the buttresses here, we can see that these may well relate to that actual episode, so we can actually tie them down in terms of time and also sort of feed into the actual history of the building. And then I'll just say a little bit briefly about Tabuk. Tabuk was a major stop on the route, and in 1672, Evliya Çelebi saw this inscription on the fort. The interesting thing, this is the only inscription actually written on ceramic tiles on the entire Hajj route, and it details the repairing of the fort in 1672. We're not quite sure when the fort at Tabuk was built originally, though, but that it mentions a repair, and also we get Mutada mentioning the repair of the cistern at the back of the fort, and also complaining about the quality of the water, which was green and had all sorts of bugs in it, and he didn't want to drink it. So lastly, I'll just come to the fort at Muazzam. We have lots of very interesting accounts of this fort. There's a problem with this fort that we don't know the exact date of the building. It's been assumed by many people to be of Mamluk origin, partly because of its round towers, which resembles Mamluk, like for example the fortified caravanserai at Aqaba and other Mamluk buildings, and also because of the presence of these lions. Although we get in other places, these lions are not really an indication of a Mamluk date, although they're used in the Mamluk period, and particularly by Baybars, they're also used much later on. And then finally, again, this fort is very interesting because it has 3 inscriptions as well as the lions. The inscriptions are all from the 17th century, and they give a lot of information about the renovation of the fort. And in particular, as you can see, this is the 3rd inscription. It mentions the master mason Nicola, son of Ilias. So we have Christian masons. And one of the interesting things is throughout the history of all of these buildings, they all seem to have been, the actual building work seems to have been carried out by Christian masons from Damascus. There's a strong tradition. So what I'd say in conclusion, because I've got to be quick, is each of these sites has a rich history, and we have the opportunity to have a really detailed idea of the individual histories of each of these sites, and I think work out exactly what the interaction of the three groups, which is, let's say, the Ottoman military, Ottoman officials, the pilgrims themselves and the Bedouin, how they interacted at these around these sites. And one of the last things I'd say, just in terms of oral history, and we get this from Doughty and I think a few other authors, is although it's easy, we may consider these as Ottoman forts. For many of the Bedouin, they considered these forts as places that belonged to them, not to the Ottomans. They regarded them as their own things which were given to them by the Ottomans, in which they could communicate with the Ottomans. Okay, thank you.